Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's guest is the Honorable Kenneth Feinberg, and the topic is compensating victims of tragedy. Now, compensating business owners in the aftermath of a tragedy isn't easy. Financial records must be confirmed and reviewed. Financial projections must be taken into account, and apportionment needs to be considered. Valuing lost or impaired human lives is an even more sensitive subject. This podcast presents a unique opportunity to listen to the world's foremost compensation experts discussing related issues. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Solution Nation. My name is David Wanatik. I'm the CEO of the Solution Nation podcast series and also the CEO of Certified Patent Valuation Analyst. Today, we have a very exciting program. We're going to speak with Professor Kenneth Feinberg. In many circles, Professor Feinberg needs no introduction, but for those that are not aware of his fine work, Mr. Feinberg is a lawyer and mediator, a former chief of staff to Senator Edward Kennedy, and a member of 2 presidential commissions. He is also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University, the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and New York University. He was a special master in compensation cases such as Agent Orange, the British Petroleum's oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and did wonderful pro bono work in connection with the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, the Virginia Tech shooting, and Troubled Asset Relief Program. So, Professor Feinberg, thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here, David.
It's a real honor to have you here. So in your work, in your compensation work, are there any philosophical underpinnings, any Talmudic underpinnings, or Aristotelian or Platonic or Socratic underpinnings, or is it more governed by modern day law?
Well, it's governed by modern day law, but I must say, after you do these for a while, you do sort of gain some perspective about these programs. One perspective is they are very, very rare, and they should remain rare. The idea that there'll be special compensation programs for the select few. Every other innocent victim, fend for yourself. You get your lawyer, I'll get my lawyer, judge and jury. But for a few very special programs like 9/11, like the Boston Marathon bombings, like the Virginia Tech shootings, policymakers decide just for you special compensation. Now, I must say, that is not American. It is not the way we normally do things. Bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's no 9/11 fund. So in terms of the Talmud, I guess I would say that be careful about singling out very special innocent victims for a very generous program. Everyone else, you're ineligible.
Okay. What should be the parameters of having a special tribunal, a special policy for certain classes of victims?
Voluntarily, do the American people want one? You know what guides these programs like 9/11 or Boston Marathon? What guides these special programs a demand from the electorate, from the American people who are so touched by the tragedy that they instruct their elected officials, the Congress, a governor, a president, like President Bush after 9/11. We want a special program. The community decides. The community is the litmus test, whether or not you do it.
Okay. So I'd like to have a hypothetical. It resembles a real event that took place. And in going through this hypothetical, we can talk about some of the work you did and that you wrote about in your book, Who Gets What, one of Professor Feinberg's books. So let's say, God forbid, there's another terrible event. Let's say we have a high-rise building. On the first several floors, there's retailers. Above the retailers are offices, and above the offices are residences. So God forbid the whole building crashes because of a terrorist incident. Let's talk about the different theories of compensating the different classes. You have the retailers, the general businesses, the offices, and then the residences. So for the...
Go ahead.
Okay, so maybe we'll start at the bottom with the retailers. As far as compensating the retailers, is it just a function of whatever their insurance will pay? If there was a special fund set up to compensate all involved, the retailer, what would be the guidelines for compensating the retailers? Is it just letting them file insurance claims and that's it, or should more be done?
Insurance has nothing to do with it. Zero. If it's decided, you've already assumed there's going to be a fund. That's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not there's a fund and who is eligible under that fund are very important policy decisions that have to be made at the outset. Now, under your hypothetical, let us assume a fund has been created to compensate death and physical injury of those killed or injured as a result of the collapse. All right. I don't care if it's a retailer, a newspaper person who happened to be delivering a newspaper, a guest of the retailer, a customer. How do we decide who's eligible? And I'm assuming in your program, the program is compensating death and physical injury. Doesn't matter if it's a retailer, a plumber, or a guest. They're all eligible.
Mm-hmm. In your work with the British Petroleum oil spill, of course, businesses were compensated. In doing that, there's a lot to it. But would you look at the amount of money they can recover from insurance, and would that offset any compensation that you would offer?
In BP, after we compensated all of the deaths and injuries in the Deepwater Horizon rig explosion, now we had the problem you present. What do you do about businesses that can't fish in the Gulf, can't shrimp, can't oyster harvest, can't go on tours because the Gulf oil has closed the beaches and closed the waters of the Gulf? Well, the law is pretty clear. Economic loss. What is the damage done to your business caused by the oil spill? What assumption should be made? And then you pay the claim. No one died. No one was injured. These are claims for economic harm. That is, my business is closed because I no longer have access to the Gulf. So, Mr. Feinberg, my oyster beds are damaged, caused by the oil. Pay me. Pay me my lost income, my lost revenue as a result of the oil spill. And Feinberg evaluates the claim. And if the closing of the oyster beds is the proximate result of the oil spill, pay to the order of the oyster bed owner. Here it is.
Mm-hmm. Would you factor in future economic damages? So if that oyster harvester bought a new machine the day before the catastrophe and got a new distribution agreement, But his past financials don't indicate that. They indicate he was only making $100,000 a year, but he's going to make $200,000 a year with the investments.
Absolutely. That's a valid assumption. You've just explained that the oyster harvester, here's the receipts for a new business, a new machine, and here's my contract to distribute oysters for the next 18 months to Acme Inc. Pay it. Pay it. That's not so hard. The hard problem, you're on to something. The hard problem is when the oyster harvester comes and says, I can't harvest oysters this year because of the oil spill. And I'm telling you, Mr. Feinberg, it will take 10 years for my oyster beds to be back to normal as a result of the spill. I have a latent claim, not only for current damage, but for 10 years of future damage. Pay me. That gets tougher.
Yeah, yeah. What about the duty to mitigate? So let's say there was a restaurant affected by the oil spill, and typically people would sit in the restaurant, but the restaurant was damaged. Would you say, well, you have a duty to try to mitigate your damage by having more catering, or takeout service or delivery service? So duty to mitigate, how important is that in offsetting damages?
Yes, we do require in all of these programs, if you have economic loss, how do you mitigate that loss? We'll pay the difference. So, for example, with shrimp or oysters, well, you can't shrimp in the Gulf. Okay. Have you acquired and purchased shrimp from Vietnam or from an oyster bed in California? Or how have you mitigated the damage so that my check for compensation will take that into account? Sometimes you can mitigate. Sometimes you can't mitigate.
Okay, and if somebody did not want to make efforts to mitigate, their compensation would be less then?
Yes, unless they say you can't mitigate. For example, the oyster harvester, Mr. Feinberg. My oysters in the Gulf of Mexico are the best in the world. My customers know this. If I go mitigate with Vietnamese shrimp, that'll never work. They'll never buy those. They'll know. Gulf of Mexico shrimp are very, very special. I can't mitigate. Okay. We conclude that you either can't mitigate or your mitigation is very narrow or very de minimis because some people may eat Vietnamese shrimp and others won't. So you have to try and make assumptions and try and make this work.
Mm-hmm. I suppose if that oyster farmer said, I spent a lot of money branding our oysters as coming from the Gulf, and it would be a violation of truth in marketing or mislabeling food products, I can't mitigate.
Absolutely. You can't mitigate.
Okay.
We take the facts, David, as they're presented. We evaluate the arguments, we make certain conclusions and certain decisions, and compensate on the basis of those assumptions.
Okay. And another interesting thing that came out of your work with British Petroleum during that crisis was a lot of these small businesses did business on a handshake and cash-based businesses, but they have to demonstrate what their real revenues and income were. Not so those who did business. Yeah,
that is correct. I can't make payments on your representation. Well, we do a handshake down here. If you can't document your damage, you're not getting paid. Now, there are very rare exceptions to that. If you're a waiter at a restaurant that is closed on the Gulf because of there's no clientele, no one's coming to the restaurant, we will assume that there is a standard payment made to a waiter for services rendered. And whether that's 15%, 20%, 22.5%. So we did develop sort of algorithms, formulas for certain businesses that you don't expect corroboration. like waiting in a restaurant. And what should the tip be at the end of the meal? We had a methodology based on statistical information about tips in that area of business, and we applied that in our economic model. We didn't require corroboration because there is no corroboration when somebody leaves extra cash on the table.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and maybe I asked this before, maybe I didn't catch on to it, but if the final conclusion was that a business deserves $100,000 as compensation and they receive $30,000 from their insurance, the net payment you would pay under these different compensation schemes would be $70,000.
No, we'd pay 100.
You pay 100, even though if they recover.
Yeah, here's why. It takes too long to recover from your insurance carrier, and you get into fights with your insurance carrier. So as long as you're paid for your damage, we'll pay it. Don't even report it to the insurance carrier. We don't care. You got $100,000 worth of damage, we're paying you $100,000. Now, whether or not you have an obligation to tell your carrier that, etc., but if you're not making a claim, what are you telling them? I mean, here's the money. And don't forget, there are many, many businesses in this country that don't have any insurance.
Right. So I suppose the same principle is at work for those who stood, maybe after the World Trade Center, those who stood to receive charity from different charitable organizations that popped up. That wouldn't be a factor in your awarding compensation. So if the teachers union agreed to give every child $100,000 for their education, that would be on top of whatever you determine would be the fair compensation.
That's correct. Now that you have raised a very difficult issue. In the 9/11 fund, the statute required me to offset collateral sources of income. You could say charity. The statute said that. Well, I went and spoke to the charities, and they said, if you do that, if you're going to offset charitable contributions, we're going to hold on to our money for the next 2 years while you pay out your money. We're not going to subsidize the taxpayer. We'll just sit on the money. Didn't want that. So we carved out an exception, just as you said just now, and we did not deduct charitable contributions to each family, even though a strong argument could be made that I should have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, in this hypothetical example where a building comes down, or it could be the British Petroleum type situation, let's say that there's a business that's devastated, but in this case, the business is not a local store or restaurant, an office that processes credit card payments. Let's say was in the World Trade Center or in Louisiana. So the whole company is still healthy, but part of their business was damaged. That office was destroyed. How would you go about trying to figure out what kind of compensation American Express deserves for the loss of their office?
Like American Express is like any other citizen. We'll look at your local branch that was destroyed at the World Trade Center. Provide us the data as to the revenue lost at that local store, that local branch. It's like any other claim. We'll pay it. Doesn't matter that American Express has $2 billion in other sales or whatever elsewhere. That store at the World Trade Center lost revenue because the building collapsed and the store was destroyed. We will pay it as if it was a local mom and pop store. It doesn't matter.
And I guess that would still be subject to the duty to mitigate. So they would have to shift the address. They would change the address. They don't send your payments here, send it to Delaware or whatever. Right.
That's right. And by mitigating, send your payments to another location that's safe and secure. Your damages might be offset by 90% because you picked up almost all of the business from that local destroyed branch and have transferred it elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now maybe we get to the most difficult issue is valuing life, valuing lives lost. So some of your work valued everyone's life equally. without regard to the expected remaining years of life or income earning potential. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Valuing lives, contrary to what you've just said, valuing lives is not rocket science. It's done every day in every court in the United States. It's done in Washington and New York and Montana and Arizona and Texas, everywhere. Judges and juries ask the very same questions in valuing lives. What would the victim have earned over a work life, but for the tragedy? Add something for pain and suffering, emotional distress, equals, that's it. It's not rocket science. You could do it, and I'm sure many, many, many Americans could do it as well. What's really tough in valuing lives is not the algorithm, not the formula. It's the emotion, you see. It's the emotion of dealing with survivors who come to see you in grief to explain the impact of a lost loved one. That is debilitating. The actual calculations, not so difficult. In 9/11, in BP, everybody received a different amount of money depending upon their financial situation, etc., because you had to sign a release that I won't sue, you see. So everybody gets a different incentive. In the Boston Marathon bombings or Virginia Tech, where the program wasn't tied to the tort system, the litigation system.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody could get the same. Do what you want with the money, but that's much easier. You know, everybody gets the same, whether you're a 5-year-old, a waiter, or a bank president. If you die because of the marathon bombing, you got a flat amount. All lives were equal. You can't do that in the tort system.
Mm-hmm. So under the tort system, lives are valued basically on one's earning ability.
That's right. That's correct. And if you're too young to have any earning ability, babies died in 9/11 on the planes. There's no way to calculate earning because you've never had any earnings. Well, we create a fiction and say that the baby is entering the workplace at the age of 32, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we pay based on the basic revenue income at age 32 until natural retirement from the workforce at 62. And we make that calculation. It's not that difficult.
Okay. All right. So we're just looking at somebody's earnings potential, not their value to their family or anything else.
We do not factor in loyalty, love, courage, integrity, compassion. Irrelevant. The work life, pain and suffering equals a check.
Mm-hmm. In tragedies like the World Trade Center, was there an effort to look at causation? Was there any effort to say that somebody may have had a heart attack a minute before the tragedy, or was it just assumed that everybody was killed because of the tragedy?
No. You have to make certain assumptions. Now, they're not hard to make because 9/11 involved a traumatic horror where the causal connection between the conduct and the injuries and deaths is pretty clear. So if there were cases, if a policeman, for example, let's say the policeman's, I'm making this up, 52 years old. The policeman sees that 20 people are trapped in the World Trade Center, and he rushes in and he saves all 20 at great risk to his life, and he brings them to the Manhattan ferry and gets on the ferry with them and takes them out of harm's way to Staten Island. And as he gets off the boat with the 20 people covered with soot and ash, the policeman drops dead of a heart attack. Is that policeman considered a victim of the 9/11 attacks? Well, let's look at his medical records. Does he have a heart condition? Was he warned about the condition? Was he warned that he ought to retire? If there's no record of heart trouble or anything, he's a victim. Include him in the list of victims for 9/11. But it gets a little tricky. In 9/11, let's say that a elderly woman is hanging a painting on her wall on East 95th Street, 5 miles from the World Trade Center. She looks and sees that a plane has crashed right into the World Trade Center. Aghast, she falls off the ladder and breaks her leg. Is that a 9/11 physical injury? No, it's not. The statute creating the 9/11 fund says that the victim must have died or been injured in the immediate vicinity of the World Trade Center. We concluded that 5 miles away is not causation.
So a similar principle was at work in the Virginia Tech shootings. You specified which classrooms the students would have had to have been sitting in during certain hours. And only those students were eligible for compensation.
Well, you're mostly right about that. That issue involved purely mental trauma. All of the deaths, except a few, occurred in one classroom. A few students were able, while the gunman was reloading, a few students were able to jump out a window and escape. Now they filed a claim saying, we didn't suffer physical injury or death, but we can't get out of bed in the morning. We're so depressed. We were there and witnessed the carnage. My next door neighbor, the student in the next chair, I watched her get her brains blown out. A student to my right, I saw him die. Then the gunman pointed the gun at me and pulled the trigger. It malfunctioned. While he was trying to get the gun to work, I jumped out a window. But I'm suffering from PTSD. We concluded if you were in the room and witnessed the horror, we would pay you. If you were across the street watching from your dormitory window, we wouldn't pay you. These are the decisions you make in determining eligibility.
Right. So very specific where the claimant is located. Very, very specific on that. And I think in other of your work, maybe it was the World Trade Center, you specified that pain and suffering was a function, or maybe that this was physical injury. Physical injury was a function of hospitalization. Right. So the more time somebody spent in the hospital, the more compensation they were deserving of.
That's correct. If you're in a hospital for a month, hospitalization is a pretty good surrogate for seriousness of injury. If you're in for a month because of the attacks and your next door neighbor is only in there for 3 weeks, you should get more than your next door neighbor. The hospitalization took longer. That's a factor.
Yeah, so that's a very important point. So I'll use hospitalization as an objective surrogate for pain and suffering.
No, not necessarily. In 9/11, we didn't use hospitalization as a surrogate. We did in the Boston Marathon. In 9/11, what we wanted to know was, did the victim die? and leave a wife or a husband and children. So here was the formula for pain and suffering. After you've calculated economic loss, add $250,000 for the death of the victim and $100,000 for each spouse and or dependent child. So if you're getting $1 million for economic loss, the victim in the airplane, that's another $250. Left a wife, that's $350, and 2 kids, that's $550. $1,550,000 for economic loss, pain, and suffering tied to a formula, objective formula, the spouse and number of children.
Mhm.
Very
Okay.
objective, very clean, very easy to calculate without trying to calibrate different amounts of pain and suffering or hospitalization. In those cases, we didn't do that.
Mhm. And I guess you have to be somewhat immune to pain and suffering. In the book, you talked about during the World Trade Center, when you were calculating the damages for dependents, there was one gentleman that died that had a mistress and had children with the mistress. So the question was, should that count as a spouse, or the children? Should they get compensated? And what emotional trauma might that lead to the grieving wife?
First of all, we never told the grieving wife. So to this day, I don't know if the grieving wife knew. But in that case, economic loss for the victim, the father, the husband. The mistress is not a spouse. She gets nothing. But she is a guardian for the 2 children by her lover. They each get $100,000. So it's $2,200,000. We never told the wife of the mistress. She probably knows, it's been 20 years or more now. And the children probably know each other, but we didn't think it was our place to get into family and circle, all of that.
Right. Right. So it seems through all these cases you work that the money is not as important as maybe we would think. A lot of bringing solace to the victims' families is the process, that they believe that the process is fair and equitable. So do you want to say anything about that?
You're absolutely right about that. I would have thought in the 9/11 fund, people would come to see me privately, due process, to demand more money. No, people didn't do that. People came to see me for 2 reasons. One, anger. They want to vent about life's unfairness. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my daughter at the World Trade Center. She was 19. She was an angel. Don't tell me there's any God. How could God allow something like that to happen? The government was asleep at the switch, blah, blah. I mean, people come angry about the curveball that's been thrown them in life. Or they come to validate the memory of a lost loved one. Mr. Feinberg, I was married to my wife for 25 years, and she's gone now. And I want to show you a video of our wedding 25 years ago. I know it won't have any bearing on the amount of money I get, but you're going to watch, because I want you to see what an angel my wife was. And people want to validate the memory. You see, they want somebody to hear about the death of a loved one. And it is very, very emotional.
Sometimes small memorials, almost trinkets, can really act as a salve to some grieving people. When the people came in, was there any special way you handled them? Did you have professional counselors, psychologists, grieving professionals? Did you give them little mementos, or was it just the lawyers that were talking to the people?
Oh, no. Many people came without lawyers. Some came with rabbis or priests. Some came with their accountant. Some came with family members. No. They came to talk to me about anything they wanted to talk about. Some brought teddy bears and medals and certificates of good conduct and diplomas. And my office was filled with memorabilia and mementos. And that was their prerogative if they wanted to do that. I was more a rabbi or a priest than I was a claims administrator. I mean, my law degree, well, I would have preferred a divinity degree or a degree in psychiatry. That would have helped me even more.
But when the grieving families came, did they meet just with you or other lawyers, or did you have grievance counselors or psychologists help receive them?
Nope, just me. They could bring anybody they wanted.
Okay.
But as far as me, I was there with a reporter transcribing the hearing. And maybe I had a staff person with me, but it was very, very tragic and debilitating. And I didn't encourage other staff members to come with me. It's too hard on them.
So a couple interesting things came out about compensation in your book. Number one, on the one hand, some people didn't want that much compensation for themselves, as you were saying. Another example of that is in the work you did for the veterans with afflicted by Agent Orange. Many of those veterans, they wanted compensation for their brethren, not necessarily themselves.
That's right.
And they wanted to establish a fund or a mechanism to help other veterans with maybe more everyday type problems.
That's right. We did that. We listened carefully, Judge Weinstein and myself. We examined all of the, we invited any Vietnam veteran to come and tell us what to do with the money. Many of them said, I don't want the money. I want my fellow soldier, my comrade, and his family. Let them have the money. There was a fairly widespread communitarian ethic in Vietnam involving the soldiers.
Okay. On the other hand, though, another issue is that are we talking about absolute compensation or relative compensation? Right.
I don't know what you mean.
So I think in the book you mentioned that somebody may have received a compensation award, let's say for $5 million, and that was more money than they ever thought they would deserve. But if their neighbor got $6 million, they would focus on the differential, not the absolute value that they received.
Absolutely. What you learn is that everyone counts other people's money. Mr. Feinberg, you're giving me $5 million. I never made more than $50,000. $5 million. How dare you? My next door neighbor is getting $6 million. You never even met my wife or my husband. Now you're tarnishing their memory. How dare you? When you try and explain that the next door neighbor, first of all, who says the next door neighbor got $6 million? That's the first thing. But quite apart from that, Mr. Jones, the reason the next door neighbor is getting $6 million is his wife made more than your wife. An economic law. Well, that gets you nowhere, David. Nowhere. And it's tough. That's one of the big problems when you have a collective program involving thousands of claims rather than one claim. And it's a real problem because it's very divisive. Mm-hmm. Everybody counts other people's money.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that in the torts compensation you granted, there was no confidentiality. People could disclose their awards.
I guess if they want to. Most didn't want to disclose. Most were afraid that if they ever did disclose, their kids would get kidnapped, ransomed. So they wanted to make sure it was confidential, but I had no say in that. That was up to them.
Okay.
Nor did I have any say in how the money should be spent. None of my business. Right, here's the cash. Do what you want with it.
Yeah. There were others that had a different point of view. I think you rightly said there's no way to monitor this. We don't want to dictate how people live their lives. It's their money; they can do what they want with it. Still staying on the process. So you handled the people that came to visit you very well, very demonstrated a lot of sensitivity in those meetings, and probably did a lot to give them some relief. But in the British Petroleum situation, because there were so many claimants, the process was open. The meetings were open to lots of members of the community. And some of those meetings got boisterous and antagonistic. And so I guess the lesson here is have those discussions individually with various bereaved people rather than whole communities.
Well, you got to be careful about that assumption. I found that those town hall meetings, however boisterous, however fraught with emotion and tension, were very important. I thought it important in terms of transparency to explain to everyone at the same time, this is what I can do and what I can't do. Now, if anybody also wanted or requested a private meeting, just that person and me, fine, I'm glad to do that as well. And I did a lot. I conducted 950 separate meetings in 9/11. But I think the town hall meetings are important in getting the message out. Look, I'm not Superman. I'm not a magician. This is what I can do and what I can't do.
Okay. Is sovereign immunity, is that an inviolable notion? Are there opportunities to sue governments if governments do something wrong? I know with Agent Orange, there was something like that, but in more modern times?
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard to sue a government. 9/11 Fund was a voluntary program enacted by the government. It didn't have to. It's very hard to get around sovereign immunity. In Agent Orange, you couldn't. And the Defense Department and the Air Force and the United States were immune. Today, if you can show that the government acted recklessly or with an intentional wrong, you can sue the government. It's very hard and it's very rare, but in certain circumstances, it can be done.
So, hypothetical, if it's demonstrated that vaccines for COVID are causing health problems, is it possible to sue the government because they, try to put vaccines on the market very quickly, and then in some cases the government officials were almost forcing people to take the vaccines? It wasn't so voluntary.
No, because when Congress established the COVID vaccine program, it wrote right into the law, no lawsuits. There's an administrative system you go through to get compensation, but few and far between. And no, there hasn't been much in the way of suing the government.
Mm-hmm. So this may sound like a funny question, but there are some movements in places like California to sue for reparations for slavery. There's never slavery in California, and none of the slave holders or slaves are still alive. But is there any merit to something like that going forward?
Merit? I think you can make a very strong case that reparations for slavery can be justified. The problem you've got, which is an overwhelming problem, I think, that defeats the idea, is the practicality of it. Ask yourself, reparations for slavery, who's eligible? Who's eligible? And how much money are they getting? And where is the money coming from? I think that the idea of reparations for slavery in theory makes sense. But in practice, I think it is a very difficult challenge. And I don't think you'll see it.
Mm-hmm. And last question, it seems like a funny question, but it has been discussed a little bit. If it can be demonstrated that COVID was produced in China, maybe under somewhat of the direction of the Chinese government, is there any ability to sue China for the COVID pandemic?
I don't think so. First of all, what court? Where would you get any court to be able to exercise jurisdiction? if you tried to get a U.S. court to handle such a case, I doubt that the Chinese government would have much interest in defending that case, and you might find yourself without a defendant to sue. So I doubt that you'd get very far with it. But you've asked some very, very good questions, David, over the last 45 minutes, and I'm certainly pleased to have been part of your Solution Nation.
Well, thank you very much for your generous use of your time. We really appreciate it. It was a real honor to speak with you. So fortunately, we can't continue, but thank you for writing the book. So at least we can read the books and learn about your experiences that way.
Not only that, David, but if you invite me back sometime, I'd be glad to come back for chapter 2 on your podcast. And good luck and Lashana Tova.
Lashana Tova. Okay, bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. All right, goodbye.